Protest, a modern mischaracterization of anarchy. Demonstration, march, rally, strike, revolt, mutiny. Though only 6 words, this list spans the spectrum of public outcry we generally categorize as protest. Yet, in recent years, this spectrum has shrunk. The connotations that surround the word protest are becoming increasingly violent, associating protest with lawlessness rather than an exercise of free will in the face of wrong. Instead of an outlet for change, protest has become a form of anarchy in the eyes of the media and government. Just as there is a thin line between anarchy and protest, an equally thin line exists between democracy and dictatorship. Protests have taken place for centuries, but in our modern society, they are an everyday occurrence. Protests are not always big, organized gatherings. More often than not, protests are the small acts of rebellion people perform throughout their day, bucking the traditions of the society that has held them down in one way or another. However, the protests that gain attention from the media are typically composed of many people and are well organized. In 2020, the issue of racial discrimination and inequality took center stage following the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and many others. In the following weeks and months, protesters took to the streets in outrage. Between May and June of 2020, Black Lives Matter protests were 89% nonviolent. This rose to 96% between June and September of the same year. Despite these overwhelming numbers of peaceful protests, the movement was characterized as violent simply because they raised their voices to the issue of murder. Police who enact the whims of our government responded to BLM protests with a greater degree of violence than their right-wing counterparts, 51% to 33%. Despite the right-wing protests having higher rates of violence, news coverage of these events focused on the negatives, such as any violent movements that may have occurred. They portrayed these rare instances of violence as frequent. Through direct action, like the police force, and indirect action, like media characterization, this powerful movement that was attempting to establish equality for Black Americans was demonized. More recently, in the beginning months of 2024, college students made their voices heard as they protested the war in Gaza. Of the over 500 protests that took place between April and May, 97% were peaceful, with only a handful, 20, causing serious destruction or harming other people. Force was employed anyway, with there being 70 instances of forceful intervention, including the arrest of over 2,000 students. As was the case in 2020, an overtly negative picture was painted of the protesters. Prominent government figures, including the president, criticized the protesters for their violence, even though that was a minuscule percentage of what was happening. The actions of a few were blown out of proportion and applied to the whole with the intention of striking fear in the hearts of civilians, diverting us away from what the protests were actually about. Rather than taking the criticism and improving the government, our right to protest, and by default, our right to free speech, is slowly creeping away right before our eyes. Anarchy is a powerful word, but through the actions of the government to rebrand all protesters as anarchists, it is undergoing semantic bleaching. Protest and anarchy are not the same thing. This distinction must be maintained if social progress is to be achievable in the future. Though BLM and Gaza protests were the 2 examples of this incorrect portrayal of anarchism, they are not the first, nor will they be the last. You do not have to be a minority or a college student for this issue to apply to you. One of the key elements of our democracy is our ability to critique the government. Our country's founding document was treason because it criticized Great Britain. We are a country of protesters, so to call the same processes that founded our country anarchy dismantles everything the United States was built on. I will note that while the issue is critical to everyone, Gen Z and Gen Alpha are set to inherit this system. We must be aware that there will be efforts to dull our voices, but we must not let that happen. Sometimes your voice is the only thing you have, so if you let it be taken away, you become no more than a cog in the system. There are so many things we could improve, so why should we settle for the status quo when we could actively make the world a better or more equitable place for everyone? Protests can occur on any scale. Marches and large demonstrations gain the most attention, but this is well beyond most people's comfort zone. Social media was invented to connect with others and share ideas, so start small. Speaking or posting about an injustice makes other people aware of it. Being socially aware is easier than ever with the amount of information we have at our fingertips. If social media isn't an option or just isn't your preferred way to spend your time, then find issues you resonate with and see if there are any events you could attend. Meeting people who have gone through similar things and who want to change the system so no one ever has to relive the same hardships is inspiring. If enough people find something unjust in their lives and work to improve it, the benefits will spread like wildfire. The world is not broken, but it is definitely not perfect. Though perfection may be unattainable, we must improve. People should not suffer because of the color of their skin, their identity, or their socioeconomic status. Change is brought about by all voices, loud and quiet. The stigma associated with forms of protest must be eliminated. Protest is not anarchy. In fact, it is the opposite. Protest seeks to bring awareness to and improve our current society, not dismantle it. Mischaracterizing protest as anarchy is dangerous, and the only way to remedy that is to continue to protest and show that positive change is brought about by people who stand up against injustice.